Okay, so I got a question in the comments about the settings I use for Duckstation. So I decided to make a video actually showing how to set it up and then also show off the settings that I use for my videos. So what we're going to do first is make our way to the GitHub where the program is hosted and just simply go to releases. For most people, you're going to want to use the latest development build. Latest preview build may or may not be unstable. So since I can't guarantee anything, I'm just going to recommend the development build. So we're going to scroll down here. And since we're on Windows 10, we're going to do the Duckstation Windows release version, the zip folder, and download it here. Okay, so setting up the emulator and getting it up and running is actually very simple, very quick. So once you have the file downloaded, it's in a zip file. So what you're going to want to do is open up the archive. I recommend using 7-zip, and what you end up having is all these files, and simply you just select them all. Oh, seems to be having. You simply select them all and extract them, which of course I've already done here, and it'll run right out of the box from there. You just simply go to the executables, double click, and it'll open up. Of course, I already have the game set up, but when you open it up, this will be a blank screen. And now there's two versions of the GUI. There's this basic one by Qt, and then we have this non-GUI version. I personally prefer the Qt GUI, so that's what we're going to be using here as I show you the settings. So next up, you're going to want to go into settings, and we'll just go down through the entire listing. All right, so under general settings, these are just basic normal settings. The only one that I changed, I believe, was just the enable Discord presence. I don't really like showing off what I'm doing on Discord. But everything else here, these are the default settings. You can just go through and determine whether or not you want to use them. They're pretty self-explanatory. Next up will be the BIOS settings. Now, of course, Duckstation can't run without a BIOS, so you do need to have a BIOS file. Now, since we're on YouTube, I can't tell you where to get one legally. And of course, if you can always just have your own PS1 and dump the BIOS from there onto your PC. Now, the only setting otherwise here that I would point out would be the fast boot. I have this enabled. It's disabled by default, and it can cause issues with some games. So if you do have problems, if you have this enabled and you have some problems booting up games, I would recommend disabling this. Okay, next up is console settings. Of course, you have your default region. I'm NTSC. If you want to play a Japanese game or a PAL region game, then you would be selecting that or just have it on auto detect. But of course, I mainly play NTSC, so that's what I use. I'd recommend you keep 8 megabyte RAM disabled, because this can cause issues and bugs. It should be more or less enabled from a game-by-game standpoint than anything else. No reason to change CPU emulation, and there's no reason to change CD-ROM emulation either. Now, the main thing that comes when you increase the speed is just load times, but again, it causes issues and cause bugs. So I'd recommend by default you keep them on none or change it from a game-by-game basis. The only main thing that I've changed here is preload image to RAM. That's just to try to eliminate stutters. It increases load time when you're starting a game for the first time, but other than that, it's not much of an issue. It's still pretty quick, so I just have this enabled. Okay, next then we got emulation settings. Again, you don't want to really change anything here. Yeah, I would recommend you keep emulation speed at 100% because a lot of PlayStation games, they tie the speed of the game to the frame rate, so increasing it will kind of cause issues there. But that's also why I keep fast forward speed, turbo speed unlimited, because it's basically just doing that, just increases the frame rate. Okay, so game list, of course, if you'll have your ISOs. So here's how you set this up, is you just simply click the plus button, and it lets you pick wherever you want the game, pick the folder that the ISOs are in, which I've already set up here. And then you just simply, scan for new games or rescan all games. It's just pretty quick and simple. Hotkeys, I don't really change anything under hotkeys except for the fast forward button, of course, because, that's just the button that you press to speed up the game, just like any emulator. Controller settings is where you set up, the controller, map out the keys or the buttons if you happen to have a actual PlayStation controller or any controller really. I'm just using some cheap generic brand controller. It works perfectly fine, so you likely won't have any issues there. Next up is memory cards. Now, in terms of saving, I would recommend you keep the setting where it's separate card per game, which will, of course, at least in the emulator, will treat every time you start a new game, it'll have its own memory card, as opposed to, say, shared between all games, where it's one memory card and it'll save all the games on that same memory card. The problem with this is that it'll you'll run out of space. It treats it like a real memory card, an 8 megabyte memory card, that it has limitations. But of course, if you want to do shared between all games, say you're playing Metal Gear Solid, you want to hear the Easter eggs, for example, then you would want to have multiple saves under that, because that was something that they did back then. And of course, select where you want to save the memory cards. Here, that's where you do in this folder here. Okay, so next up is display settings. This is where I mostly change things. Under renderer, by default, it's Vulkan. I recommend you keep it under Vulkan. I think for most people, you have a graphics card that can support Vulkan, and I consider that to be the best renderer. If for whatever reason you can't, though, then Direct3, D11, and OpenGL would be my next recommendation. I believe D12 is a little buggy on Duckstation, if I recall correctly. And of course, these are more or less the basic settings. I do turn on optimal frame pacing, which, as you can read, just ensures that every frame is rendered to the screen. And that's just all it is. Now, under screen display, this is where we get to the part where these are my settings versus, low versus high settings. So when I'm showing off low, I just do auto, game native. As far as I'm aware, every PlayStation 1 game is 4:3 by default, so you could just select this if you wanted to have the native aspect ratio, but I just keep it on auto just to be safe, just in case there are some games that might not necessarily use that aspect ratio. And of course, showing off high, I got a 16:9 monitor, it's 1080p, so we just use that. Under crop, I always keep it under only overscan. No issues. If I use none, then you're going to see more black bars. And I believe all borders kind of stretches the image a little bit, or like cuts off actual image parts so that there are 0 black bars. So I'd recommend just doing only overscan area. Then we have downsampling. This is generally for games like, think Resident Evil or the Final Fantasies, where they got the pre-rendered backgrounds, but you also got 3D models that you're moving around. I keep it disabled personally, but you could use box, which I would recommend if you were playing, like a Resident Evil or Final Fantasy, because it'll smooth the 2D background without really affecting the 3D models all that much. I mean, for me personally, I don't like that it blurs the image, but that's just up to you. That's personal preference. But for me, I keep it disabled. And then for these settings, I keep them all disabled regardless. Integer upscaling just basically makes it so that it's integer numbers. So instead of, like, let's say I'm on 16:9, it doesn't actually stretch the image fully to the display because of how the resolutions are rendered on the PlayStation. Whereas stretch to fill, of course, fill, it's basically like with crop, but it's stretching the image as opposed to cropping the image. And then linear upscaling, that provides a filter on top. It makes it a little blurrier, in my opinion, so I keep it off. Okay, next up is enhancement settings. Now, this is where most of the changes occur. As you can tell, internal resolution scale, that's just basically what resolution the game will render in. If I'm doing native, it'll be 1x, of course, because that's the native resolution. And then if I'm maxing out the settings, it'll be 16x. Next comes texture filtering, which, of course, again, just similar with linear filtering, it'll kind of filter out the textures. Now, performance-wise, they have it slows down a lot when you're at 16x. So if you did want to use texture filtering while also increasing the internal resolution, I'd say no more than 9x. And I think for some settings, they actually require that you have to be 8x at most. So 8x, 9x if you want to use texture filtering, but I don't, so I'm on 16x. Then we got true color rendering. As it says, it basically disables dithering, because dithering was just a trick that they used back then because they didn't really have the hardware in order to support true, like they say, true color rendering at 24-bit. So enable it when I'm on the high settings, disable if you want something more native, or if you want dithering, which if that's the case, then I would recommend you turn on scaled dithering for your own personal enjoyment. Of course, I don't use it when I'm making the videos. Then we got widescreen hack. Of course, this just basically increases the FOV as opposed to stretching the image when you go from the 4:3 to 16:9. So, but of course it breaks some games, so I don't have this enabled. And I usually mention when I disable it in the settings in the description. So if you are curious about whether or not I'm using the widescreen hack, but typically I'm going to be using it. I just mainly disable it when there are situations where the game developers obviously don't expect you to be in widescreen. So they'll have like the game doesn't render what should be outside of your point of view, and it just ends up, having some gaps, and it just doesn't look very good. Software renderer, I just use this for performance reasons. You can have it disabled if it causes issues. I haven't had any issues using it, but I do disable it when I'm on the low settings. But either way, it doesn't really matter. It's just a performance thing as far as I'm aware. I don't think it affects the graphics or anything about the game. Then now we're under display enhancements. So we got interlacing. Of course, some games use 480i, and this of course just makes it so that they are in 480p. It's the progressive scan. I turn off the setting which enables interlacing when I'm on low settings, and of course I enable it when I'm on the higher settings, just because we're going to be well above 480i, 480p in these examples. I don't worry about forcing NTSC timings because I don't play any PAL games. I would keep this disabled anyway, just because, again, there are a lot of games that are tied to the frame rate in terms of their speed, so this would make the game run faster if it was a PAL region. Forced 4x3 on 20-bit display, which is just, as it says, disables widescreens for FMVs. I just keep it disabled regardless. I mean, of course, I'm not showing off FMVs, but I don't think the stretching is an issue for those videos. And most games, of course, don't use FMVs for gameplay. Of course, they're, like Final Fantasies do have FMV cutscenes. So, if you don't like the look of it, you could enable this just if you don't want stretching. And then chroma smoothing on 24-bit. Again, it doesn't really matter in my videos because I don't show off FMVs, but this is just basically, giving a, smoothing for an FMVs. It reduces the blockiness that you would notice because of the upscaling. And then finally, we have the Pgxp settings. Generally speaking, just not going to explain how they work, but generally the idea is that they kind of reduce the wobble and warping that you would notice in a PS1 game because of their limited texture space. Generally speaking, I just have it disabled when I'm, of course, because the original PS1 didn't have this, when I'm on the low settings. When I show off the high settings, I'm generally only going to do these four: the geometry correction, culling correction, texture correction, and preserve projection precision. I keep these two off because they do occasionally have bugs, but of course, if a game requires it, I would turn it on if they need it. Like for example, this can cause very low performance, so I keep this off. And I know I've run into a few bugs with CPU mode, so I also keep that off as well. Okay, and then moving on to post-processing settings, I only have one setting, which is the scan lines. It basically, imitates scan lines on TVs back then. I have this enabled. It might be a little controversial. I have this enabled when I'm showing off the low settings because I am trying to show off what the game would have looked like back then. And then, of course, when I'm on high settings, I keep it disabled. Personally, I do actually like the look of scan lines if I was to use, 1x resolution, but that's personal preference. So, that's up to you, and you can change things. I just keep it on the default here. Then finally, I don't change anything under audio, I believe. The backend, QB buffer size doesn't matter if you're using QB. And then, synced output, resampling, I just keep all that under the default. Achievement settings, don't touch it, and doesn't really mean anything to me. And then finally, advanced settings, I also have this under the default, but as you might have noticed, there is anti-aliasing. So if you want, you could use anti-aliasing. Of course, it adds performance, so if you have some lag, I would say this would be something you can disable. But since I'm on 16x, I don't think you really need anti-aliasing. And then other than that, that's all the settings for Duckstation. So if you if you found this video useful, if you liked it, leave a like, and if you like what I do on the channel, then subscribe. But other than that, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a nice day.